welcome to another episode of Judge of Character. As always, I am your host, Steve. In continuing with the Halloween extravaganza, it's time we take a look at the most famous vampire of all time. No, not him! That's not a vampire. That's an emo wannabe with glitter skin and more moose than Canada. No, kiddies, I'm talking about the other most famous vampire of all time. The one that set the bar for how all other vampires would soon follow. I am, of course, speaking of none other than Count Dracula himself. Every character type has that one defining version. For superheroes, it's Superman. For slasher villains, it's Jason Voorhees. And for vampires, it's... God damn it, no! Can we focus here? When you think of classic vampires, you're really thinking of Dracula. This character is arguably the most famous representation of the vampire ever seen in fiction. Obviously, the Count has had a major influence on how we perceive vampires in fiction today. So sit back, kiddies, and get comfortable, and be mindful of any sudden hickeys you might find. Let's take a closer look at Count Dracula. While vampires have been around for far longer, in various civilizations, mythology, and folklore, the modern vampire was first created by author Bram Stoker in his 1897 novel, Dracula, a story about a nobleman from Transylvania who moves to England and is much more monstrous than he first appears. Count Dracula is considered by many to be the granddaddy of the modern vampire archetype. While the many elements of vampires, such as the weakness to sunlight and crosses, have been around for centuries, Stoker's novel was the first to modernize the vampire mythology and bring all of the elements together in the form we recognize today. In fact, he invented some of them, such as the vampire having no reflection. So who is Dracula, and why should you be terrified of him? The origins of the character are somewhat muddled. The most well-known version is that Stoker based the character off real-life Romanian Vlad III, who was also known as Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula. However, despite Stoker making connections between the fictional Dracula and the real Dracula, it's not entirely sure if Vlad was the sole inspiration. There's belief that at least part of the character was also inspired by the story of the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory, who murdered hundreds of young women for years and bathed in their blood in order to retain her youth. Oh, Lizzie, you're doing it wrong. You're supposed to bathe in the blood of your enemies. Oh, silly girl. While there is some dispute about the origins, most fans tend to accept Vlad III as their proto-Dracula, if you will. Although I kind of wish that he'd done that in the original novel instead of just simply biting his enemies. Can you imagine how much differently we'd be viewing vampires today if he had done that in the original novel? So what is Dracula about? The original novel involves the titular character moving from Transylvania to England in an attempt to, yes, take over the world.
Of course!
God damn it. Yes, that is the basic plot. Dracula is trying to take over the world or die trying. Granted, it's still worth the read, being told in the form of correspondence between various characters with bits of newspaper clippings throughout. But with such a simplistic story, why has Dracula become so well known? Well, let's take a look. Earlier I said that he's the archetype of almost all vampires since then, and this is true. Ever since Dracula was released, and especially since the release of the film starring Bela Lugosi, who we'll get to shortly, vampiric characters have almost always been portrayed in similar ways. Namely, the suave, sophisticated, possibly with a certain amount of angst thrown in for good measure type of vampire. However, you might be surprised to know that, while he certainly is the archetype of vampires, Dracula doesn't actually follow the rules. Intrigued? Good. You see, while many of the powers and weaknesses that we attribute to vampires are still present in the novel, they're not exactly the same because Dracula actually predates them. For instance, the weakness to sunlight. In most vampire media, vampires will either explode or turn to ash in direct sunlight. Or turn into emo glitter-skin wannabes. Dracula, however, is affected differently. While it can be a hindrance, sunlight is no more harmful to him than it is to us. The problem usually involves his ability to shapeshift. Whatever form he's in when the sun rises, he's stuck in that form until it goes back down. Also, while he does sleep during the day, he doesn't have to. For him, it's like us staying up all night. Now there are some obvious powers that we all know about, such as the hypnotizing people or the shape-shifting, but did you know that there are some powers that other forms of media don't cover? For instance, did you know Dracula actually has the ability to slip through knife-thin cracks in masonry walls? Handy trick for when you've locked yourself out of the house. Like me. Several times. I'm bad with keys. Basically, Dracula has remained memorable due in part to his influence on how vampires are portrayed in later years. But is that the only reason? Oh, come on, if that were true, I wouldn't be talking about it. One element that often gets changed is the personality of the character. Dracula is often portrayed as something of a ladies' man, seducing his female and sometimes male victims before giving them the fangs. However, this isn't the case in the original novel. In fact, Dracula was a much more brutal character. While many adaptations attempt to make him something of a tragic villain character, the original Dracula's angst was caused by simply being very old and tired of being the ruler of some backwater country where no one visited. Who can blame him? If you're going to rule anything, it might as well be the world.
Of course.
No! We're better than that. So, depending on the portrayal, Dracula is either some lonely old vampire who longs for companionship, or is a megalomaniacal beast who brutalizes his victims. Sounds about right. But then there's also in the more sympathetic portrayals exactly how he becomes a vampire. Depending on which version you prefer, Dracula became a vampire in a couple of different ways. The original novel never actually goes into detail about how he became a vampire, saying that he'd been one for a very long time already. However, the 1992 film, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, gives us the idea that he'd become one after cursing God due to the death of his love. Then there's Dracula 2000, which gives us the origin that he was Judas Iscariot, and that his suicide after betraying Jesus Christ turned him into a vampire. So many variations, each one just as brutal as the last. But no matter how brutal the character remains in the various adaptations, there's one thing about him that never seems to change. This element of nobility about him. Just something about him screams upper class. This is often reinforced in works where Dracula has to work with other classic monsters. In such cases, it is not uncommon to see Dracula taking the role of leader, or at the very least, acting as if he's some entitled ass who's above the other lowly monsters. In the Monster Squad, it is Dracula that leads the other monsters in their goal. In his brief appearance on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Dracula is painted as a snooty nobleman, lording his popularity over the other vampires. Which makes sense as the character is essentially nobility. I mean, he is a count after all. Then you have to take into consideration the fact that one of his inspirations, Vlad III, was a member of the House of Draculesti. So, yes, the nobility element does make sense. But there's another thing about the character that we all know and love. Ladies, brace yourselves. Easily one of the most played aspects of the character, as well as almost any vampire, is the sexual aspect. Dracula is often seen as some sort of undead Casanova who can turn women into jelly with but a slight whisper. Not bad for a man who, according to the original novel, had, let's see, a large nose, a unibrow, hairy palms, and a cruel-looking mouth. Oh yes, ladies, that's your undead hunk of burning love right there. Come to think of it, now I'm starting to understand exactly why women flock to Edward from Twilight. And yet, despite the rather unappealing looks, Dracula remains a stud in the world of fiction, especially when he's played by someone like Gerard Butler. Okay, I understand that attraction. As always, when considering what makes a character memorable, one must look at the different portrayals of the character. Ever since its publication in 1897, Dracula has been adapted over 200 times. In fact, the only other fictional character to have more appearances in multiple adaptations is Sherlock Holmes, and that's not even counting the times where the two meet. With that many adaptations, there are several different versions of the character. Easily the most famous version is the one done by famous actor Bela Lugosi, although he's not the only one to take up the cape. Others have, if you'll pardon the pun, sank their teeth into the role, each one giving us a new version of the character that adds to the longevity. The earliest and arguably creepiest version is the film Nosferatu, a German expressionist film released in 1922 starring Max Schreck, no not him, as Count Orlok. While the name and other details have been changed, it's undeniably Dracula we're seeing here. It's also considered to be one of the creepiest versions of the character ever. Ooh, that's scarier than Miley Cyrus twerking. But easily the most remembered interpretation of the character is that of Bela Lugosi from the 1931 film Dracula. Much like how the 1931 Frankenstein film solidified the classic look of Frankenstein's monster, Dracula is responsible for the classic look we often associate with the character. The long cape, the tuxedo, the odd accent, they can all be traced back to this portrayal. Fun fact, Lugosi was actually buried with one of the Dracula capes. However, Lugosi wasn't the only one to take up the mantle in fangs. In 1992, Gary Oldman tried his hands with the character, giving us a Dracula that, while still terrifying, was much more sympathetic, suffering from a lost love. However, if there's anyone who's played a truly frightening version of Dracula, then that would have to be Duncan Regier from the Monster Squad. This film seems to keep popping up this month. Well, in any case, out of the many who've played Dracula, Regier's version is possibly one of the most frightening, not just subtly, but overtly too. Watch this short clip and see what I'm talking about.
Give me the amulet, you bitch!
Excuse me while I go change my pants. Oh, Lord. Oh, that's bad. Where were we? Oh, yes. Between Lugosi, Oldman, and even Christopher Lee, the character of Dracula has been interpreted into so many different ways, swinging between being either a complete monster or an entirely tragic figure. But one thing can be understood no matter the adaptation. Dracula is one of the most frightening monsters ever. So, to sum up, what makes Dracula a memorable character? It comes down to several elements. As the archetype of vampires, Dracula set the watermark for how vampires in future works would act. From him, we get some of our classic vampire cliches, whether it's the suave vampire noble or the bloodthirsty monster. Dracula is considered to be the vampire because of how he sets the standards. After he came around, every vampire you saw was in some way channeling the Count. From the Count on Sesame Street to Grandpa on the Munsters, it's not hard to see old Drac's presence in some way. But at the core of it, Dracula is simply a terrifying character. He's frightening because of how easily he can insinuate himself into your world before he completely rips it apart. How easily he can control you before he sinks his fangs into your neck. All elements that have been reinforced by the different actors to play him. In the end, Dracula is memorable for being both absolutely frightening, but also being incredibly enigmatic as well. Also, he had a wonderful singing voice. Well, that's it, I'm afraid. We've reached the end of our look at one of the greatest bloodsuckers ever to grace fiction. I hope you've learned something from all this. Lord knows that Emo Edward could benefit from a few lessons. In any case, I'll see you here next week on Judge of Character. As always, I'm your host Steve, reminding all of you to stay in character. And don't forget, Happy Halloween. Twilight sucks.